It's an honor to be here amidst a group of true friends of liberty. It's rare today, as you know, you're in a very select group because we're surrounded by a sea of individuals who've taken over our government, who dominate government both at the federal and state level, who are more interested in their own self-interest politically and feathering their own nests and making it possible for them to have very lucrative post-government employment than they are in pursuing the best interests of this country, in protecting from destruction our Constitution, in ensuring that future generations even have a country. You see, ladies and gentlemen, we are on the brink of a collapse of the greatest empire of liberty in the history of the world. We have so much to be thankful for, and we have so much to lose. You never value your liberty like you do when it is taken from you. When your liberty is taken from you, you realize all too suddenly how precious it was. And we are in the midst of a struggle over individual sovereignty, over liberty. Let's talk about where we came from, because that defines why we are a people of liberty. And then let's talk about what has happened to this magnificent thing, the United States of America, to bring it to this stage where it is brought low, where it is base, where it is indistinguishable from other servile peoples of the world. What has happened to cause this? Well, let's start with our history. The United States is born out of an intellectual concept in favor of individual human rights, of the rights of man, that came out of the Enlightenment era. It came about because philosophers of freedom opposed the divine right of kings. Sir Robert Filmer, in his Patriarcha, created a construct to defend the notion that only the king could have rights, and that his subjects were free only to the extent that he would allow them to be free to exercise some right. But in the Enlightenment era, after the beheading of Charles I, as Parliament became powerful for the first time, this notion that rights did not just exist in Parliament, but that they were individual rights to which we have a birthright, came about and transformed the thinking of intellectuals in the entire world. But nowhere in the world did this notion come to exist within a government except here. Elsewhere throughout the world, the concepts were discussed. As literacy grew, more and more people became aware of it. In England, in the coffee houses, they were called. Radical Whigs, they were called, opposed the political movement of the Hanoverian kings and advocated individual rights to trial by jury, to freedom of speech, to possess arms without being required to supply the government with a justification for owning a firearm to protect yourself. All of these things and more came to pass because of this notion that individuals were born with inalienable rights. This then became a part of our constitutional creed, really, the Declaration of Independence. Just governments are instituted among men to protect the rights of the governed. And whenever they become destructive of those rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish them. Just governments depend upon the consent of the governed. We had a Constitution in 1787 which embodied these basic principles in a profound way. The Anti-Federalists argued against adoption of a Constitution. They were in favor of the Articles of Confederation, or at least not the Constitution of 1787, principally because it lacked a Bill of Rights. They were fearful that if you invested government, even with enumerated powers, such as in Article 1 to the Constitution, that sooner or later those in power, as they always had done, would subvert the people's liberties, would use power abusively, and take away our sovereignty, restoring unto themselves the sovereignty that the very document, the Constitution of 1787, was designed to deny them. They feared this, and so it came to pass that the Bill of Rights, 1791, became offered to be a part of the Constitution and became part of it in 1793. Now, this is the first written Constitution of liberty in the world. When power was given to the Congress of the United States in Article I, it was specifically enumerated. There were no general powers as in Parliament. Parliament is all-powerful. Parliament makes the law, and no law is superior to it. But here in the United States, the Constitution was to be a superior law to government, was to be a written, immutable charter to guide and direct this nation, to maintain freedom, to enumerate rights in the Bill of Rights, but they weren't all rights, to include in the 9th and 10th Amendments reservations of both rights and powers to the states and the people, to have a system of dual federalism to check the growth of the government, to have principles, doctrines built into the Constitution of non-delegation, disallowing the delegation of governing power from those into which it was vested, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, into unelected hands or other hands. You see, at the time of the founding of the Republic, there perhaps was no more common principle understood and appreciated by the founding generation than this notion of non-delegation and this notion of separation of powers. James Madison, for example, said that if any two legislative, executive, and judicial powers were held in single hands, that would be the very definition of tyranny. Now, what happened to this country? Well, in the 1930s, a change was in the wind. In fact, the newspapers of the time called it the switch in time that changed 9. You see, all of a sudden, in the midst of an economic crisis, the likes of which the nation had never known, President Franklin Roosevelt came to power on a promise that he would end the Depression by expanding massively the power and scope of the federal government. And he did this through the alphabet soup agencies. He created, for the first time in our history, a massive number of independent regulatory commissions invested with power to decide questions independent of the Congress with legislative, executive, and judicial powers combined. Now, the Supreme Court, following the non-delegation doctrine, in such cases as Schechter-Poultry, held this unconstitutional. It was not constitutional to delegate governing power from the Congress, into which the Constitution vests the governing power, into the hands of independent regulatory commissions, into the hands of unelected bureaucrats who would create law and codes to regulate every aspect of the marketplace. That was unconstitutional, and repeatedly they so held. But then, in order to achieve a change in the law without the benefit of change in the Constitution, without the opportunity of the American people to vote upon the question of whether the Constitution should be amended, a court packing plan was written, which promised to add to every member of the Supreme Court then sitting one new justice for every one that was then sitting 70.5 years of age. The threat of the passage of this plan caused what I referred to before as the switch in time that saved 9. Causing the justices of the Supreme Court to protect their own skin, to ensure that they would not be powerless, to change and usher in as constitutional the notion that independent regulatory commissions could be possessed of governing power, could rule even though they were unelected. And so what has happened? Since then, over 250 independent regulatory commissions now govern the United States of America. We have moved from a nation that was a limited federal republic in which individual sovereignty was paramount, in which those who governed us were our servants, to a nation in which the governing power that creates 9/10 of all federal law is not that which issues from Congress, but is that which issues from these independent regulatory commissions, the heads of which are unelected and who are all powerful. So the basic doctrines of the Constitution, the separation of powers, the non-delegation doctrine, the takings doctrine, the original interpretation of the necessary and proper clause, all of these things have been destroyed through construction to usher in the modern welfare state, to break down all the barriers to the assumption of power by the federal government, so that it could rule as an absolute sovereign, so it could assume that state akin to absolute monarchy, which led to the American Revolution in the first place. Obamacare, a symptom of this disease of unlimited federal power. In the Sixth Circuit, we are suing to invalidate Obamacare. The case from the 11th Circuit will be heard first. Today, the justices of the Supreme Court were voting to determine whether or not they would accept cert. It is considered a virtual foregone conclusion that they will in the 11th Circuit case, because both the United States government and the attorneys general who are suing the government agree that cert should be granted. In that case, which rises now to the Supreme Court, the court in the 11th Circuit held that the individual mandate was unconstitutional, but the rest of Obamacare would stand, even though both parties had argued that the individual mandate was inextricably intertwined with the entire bill. The court acted this way. President Obama, seizing the initiative for political reasons, the administration favors having this case heard first, because if they lose, there's a possibility that they will only lose the individual mandate, which has become an albatross around the president's neck. Let's talk about that individual mandate, and let's talk about the character of those who would vote for such a thing. You see, we talked about how the nation has grown from a country that loved liberty, that made the individual sovereign, to a nation in which the people still love the liberty that they have and that they've enjoyed and that they wish their children to have and enjoy. But the leaders of the nation have all too often abandoned their role of governance and have given the power to rule to the unelected. And what we have with Obamacare is a disregard of constitutional barriers on power. The individual mandate will require every person who is not presently insured to acquire health insurance as of January 1st, 2014. What this means is whether you like it or not, whether you wish to or not, you will be paying between $5,000 and $15,000 a year to ensure that the mandate that has been imposed upon you is satisfied. If you don't do that, you will be in violation of the tax laws. You have no freedom of choice in this matter. The right to dissent is gone. The precedent established here depends upon the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause was originally intended to be an affirmative power within the government, the federal government, to break down state barriers to free trade among the states. It was never intended to lay a foundation for the deprivation of individual freedom of choice. It certainly was never intended to allow the federal government to force into interstate commerce people who were out of interstate commerce. People who don't have insurance and don't want it are not in the insurance marketplace. But what does the Obama administration argue to the courts in my case and in the 11th Circuit case? What do they argue? Well, they argue based on these modern conceptions of a government without limits. They argue that there are no limits to the Commerce Clause power, that the federal government can regulate every aspect of human life, because in one way or another, that aspect of life will have an economic consequence. They argue prematurely that the market for health care is not the market that exists, but is the market that will exist under the regulated plan. And that because the market that will exist under the regulated plan would be harmed, the regulated market, if not everyone is involved in this, they will force everyone to be involved with it. But they argue to the court this absurd and basic non sequitur, that you don't have to look at the existing market, we look at the future market. We look at the market that the government will create, and we argue that the absence of individual participation in that market harms the market. And that's the basis for extension of federal power. With this, there is no limitation to the power of the Congress of the United States. It can regulate every aspect of our lives. If this precedent is established that you must do with your own dollars what the taxing and spending power were designed to do with tax dollars, then why should the federal government tax you at all? That would be nice, but assume what they can do instead, to dictate what every after-tax dollar you have will be spent on to ensure that whatever the government thinks is in your best interest is pursued. So if I can tell you that you must buy health insurance, I can also tell you that you must pay for daycare. I can also tell you that within a year you must buy an electric car, all because we want our children protected, we want air pollution reduced. I can tell you that you must buy a particular kind of water heater. I can tell you that you must buy particular kinds of foods. I can tell you that you must expend your money to pursue these things because I'm the federal government and I know better than you do how to spend your money. This is tyranny. Now, Thomas Jefferson told us, "I am not a friend to a very energetic government. It is always oppressive." He gave us a simple plan, which was generally accepted at that time. He defined in his first inaugural address what a good government was. "A wise and frugal government shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned." This is the sum of good government, Jefferson said. And in his farewell address, George Washington, our first president, told us in no uncertain terms, in a prophetic way, about the danger of losing these protections built into the Constitution and those losses being due to the arbitrary will of individuals. He said, "Let there be no change by usurpation, for though in one instance it may be an instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed." We have lost our way. Our government is not a republic. It was. Our government is a bureaucratic oligarchy. We are no longer the sovereigns. The government is once again sovereign in all things. We do not have liberty except by leave of the government. This is the situation that the revolutionary Americans found themselves in when they realized that they could do virtually nothing as free people except by leave of George III. That is not freedom. How do we get back to liberty? What is the way back to liberty? You will be surprised to learn that it's relatively simple in its architecture, but difficult politically to achieve. Let's talk about why it's difficult politically to achieve. The sad reality is that most people in government, in political positions, would sell this nation down the river for their own financial benefit. Let me give you one example. This is unfortunately all too typical. Billy Tauzin was the Republican head of the Energy and Commerce Commission, Energy and Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives during the Bush years. President Bush, as you'll remember, created Medicare Part D, the prescription drug benefit for seniors. That welfare plan is one of the biggest corporate welfare plans in the history of this nation. And in the bill, Tauzin was the point man for the Bush administration to ensure, among other things, the inclusion of a provision that would prevent the federal government from negotiating down the per unit price of drugs based on volume purchases. There is a specific provision in the law that he put in there to make the drug companies capable of charging any price they wished for the price of a single drug to the federal government and forcing the taxpayers of the United States to pay for it and giving the government no power to negotiate down the price. And in exchange for this turning over of the United States Treasury to the pharmaceutical industry, was he punished? No. He left the Congress of the United States and became the director of the group that lobbied for the bill, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Association. And he received a handsome reward of about $2.5 million a year as a salary. He was willing to do that to this country for his own self-interest. Let me give you one more example of this kind, and there are many, many that we could give. A commissioner of the FDA was known as Lester Crawford, and before he resigned in disgrace because he failed to reveal his ownership interests in cognizable ownership interests in large pharmaceutical stock and large food company stock, companies regulated by the FDA, he defended Merck, the maker of the drug Vioxx. Vioxx was established by the FDA's own medical reviewers to be unsafe, to raise the risk of a heart attack for those who took that painkiller as much as 5 times, and to be accompanied by comparable drugs that had no such effect or only a minor effect of heart toxicity. So this is a very toxic drug. And within the agency, the medical reviewers clamored for the agency to restrict or eliminate this drug from the market. But the FDA commissioner defended the drug. And he defended the drug all the way to the end. The FDA did nothing to take it off the market. Indeed, with 10,000 adverse event reports pouring into the agency of people dying of heart attacks or suffering heart attacks, with over 140,000 reported cases of heart attack and 60,000 deaths from heart attack from this drug, the FDA commissioner, meeting with the science advisors, the medical reviewers who are clamoring for action to stop this, said that the evidence was anecdotal and that furthermore that day, just 10 days before Merck withdrew the drug itself from the market, he would approve the drug for use in pediatric rheumatoid arthritis patients, for use in children. Now, what happened to poor old Lester Crawford? He left the FDA and he went to work for a group called Policy Directions, Inc. That is, after he entered into a plea with the United States Department of Justice and paid a couple of $100,000 for his violation of these disclosure laws and the conflict of interest laws. And he's a senior policy analyst for that group and is paid handsomely. And who is among the principal clients of that firm? Merck. So far from paying a price for standing in defense of a drug that was killing people, which in my book is the equivalent of murder, he is rewarded. So you see how sick this picture has become. And the way back to liberty depends upon the following kinds of changes. We are on the brink of economic collapse. We have a national debt of $14.5 trillion. We have unpaid liabilities to Medicare and Medicaid of about $140 trillion over the next 10 years. We have a national debt that will reach $23 trillion in the next 8 years. We have a national debt that will require for financing of it an interest of $750 billion a year, more than the entire defense budget of the United States. We are in a situation that both Democratic administration economic advisors and Republican administration economic advisors describe as unsustainable. We are going to go down. And the only way to change it is to dramatically reduce the size and scope of the federal government, to restore the republic. Now, how do we do that? I wrote a bill for Congressman Ron Paul that's called the Congressional Responsibility and Accountability Act. And this is a simple measure that I believe Rand Paul is now going to introduce in the Senate. And this is what this bill does. Very simple. No regulation promulgated by an independent regulatory commission can have the force of law unless it is voted into law by the Congress of the United States. All prior regulations that have been adopted by the independent regulatory commissions will be ineffectual after 1 year unless the Congress of the United States adopts them. We have a bit of cutting to do. I know this isn't popular, but it's the only way to save the nation. You know, one of the things that's interesting about all of this is that whether we do this the smart way and prevent our children and their children and their children from suffering through an endless recession that becomes a depression, or whether we do the right thing now, the result is going to be the same. The government of the United States is going to be much, much smaller. Whether it is smaller because it can't pay its bills, because it can't tax the money out of the population, because it has destroyed the economy, or whether it is because someone got an intelligent notion in Washington, something that may never have happened in our lifetime, and has cut the budget, it's going to happen. And how do you cut the budget? What do you do? Well, it's very simple. We bring in approximately $4.2 trillion a year. We are expending about $6 trillion presently, and that figure will rise over the next decade. So you've got to cut at least $2 trillion, but if you're smart, you'll cut about 50% of the federal budget. And you just look at what needs to go. The Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation. We can privatize the airwaves. I have a book called Freedom, Technology, and the First Amendment, explaining in detail how we privatize the airwaves. They should have been private all along. Get rid of the Federal Communications Commission. There's no need for the Federal Trade Commission because we have laws against fraud and marketing and so forth, and they can very well be prosecuted by states and federal departments of justice. There's no need for a whole host of federal agencies. And as I said, if we pass this bill that I'm talking about, those agencies would disappear anyway because Congress isn't going to pass into law and take responsibility for a lot of the awful regulations that are hamstringing the economy. But it's not enough to cut the budget by over $2 trillion presently. It's not enough. That has to be done over time as well. $2 trillion now, another $2 trillion down the road, because the budget grows even when we're sitting still. And the point is that we not only have to cut the budget, but we also have to give the nation some relief. And in order to inspire an economic boom in this country, if anyone had half a clue in Washington, you would do something very simple. You see, 40% of tax revenues are the individual income tax. The average American taxpayer pays between $12,000 and $15,000 a year. We know our economy is in dire straits. We know that the whole world is in dire straits. We know Greece is going down. We know Italy is going down. We know the European Union is going down, and that's a good thing. But the point is, we do need to get government off our backs, to eliminate the regulations, to reduce its size and scope, and to liberate the American taxpayer from the burdens that it has experienced. We can eliminate the individual income tax. We can allow the American people to keep their money, and we can create one of the biggest booms in American history. If you kept your tax dollars and spent them as you will, however you will, with total free choice, this would be an economic miracle virtually overnight. But the problem with this idea, from Washington's standpoint, is the loss of power. You see, I can't be Emperor Obama if I don't have an empire. A Congress critter who is not filled with his own self-love, a nice salary, and all the perks of being a member of Congress, which are many, is a humble man. And humility and politics rarely go together. But we have got to force our representatives to be humble. And the Tea Party movement, the last thing I'm going to talk about, your movement, whether you are a part of the Tea Party or not, it doesn't matter, you're freedom advocates. You've got to vote, and you have to vote the rascals out. You have to let 2012 be a bellwether year where the Senate changes hands, where the White House changes hands. But don't trust those who go in behind them. Hold their feet to the fire. We have the power to save our nation, but only we can save it. The Congress is hopelessly inept. The President is inept. Given an opportunity to present an economic recovery plan, he does nothing but propose more stimulus bills. We don't want stimulus bills. We want the government off our backs. Liberty built the greatest nation in the world. It built the greatest marketplace in the world. Slavery doesn't work. It didn't work when we took people of color and enslaved them, and it won't work if we enslave the entire American population. Have courage. Do what has to be done. Don't accept no for an answer. Make this nation be free. Whether the Congress of the United States or the President of the United States like it or not, let your representatives know they are responsible and accountable to you. Let them know that your vote isn't free, that that's one thing that you will not allow be free, and that you will compel them to do your bidding in restoring a republic in the federal government and in the state governments, and liberating us to be a free people, letting us be responsible for our own conduct, and letting us live a life that we choose to live, choosing the choices that we wish, not the government wishes. Let's become that great republic. Let's not forget our forebears. Let's not forget the miracle of liberty that they gave us. Let's not forget the Declaration of Independence. Let's not forget that a wise and frugal government shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. That truly is the sum of good government. That was the sum of good government, and that's what good government will be in the future, so long as we have the courage to make it so. Thank you very much.